Welcome to Comic Book Corner. I'm Dan De La Torre. In our shout-out segment tonight, we want to give a huge congratulations to Newbie Comics, a good friend of mine. He made his 100th episode yesterday. A great member of the community. He had practically the Illuminati show up to congratulate on his 100th episode achievement. Check out his show. He's on Sunday and Tuesday, 6:30 Pacific, 9:30 Central. Newbie, this is to you and to your next 100 episodes. Congratulations, and thanks for being such a great member of the community. Let's get to our segment here. When I was growing up, there were two franchises that influenced me the most. One was Marvel Comics, thanks to Stan Lee and the Silver Age bullpen, which exploded the interest in comics back in the 60s. But another one was Star Trek. Star Trek, created by Gene Roddenberry, also in the 60s. I wanted to parallel the two gentlemen here because both of them had a similar storyline, if you will. Stan Lee had to struggle through the 50s and finally gained success in the 60s. Gene Roddenberry didn't struggle, but he had to deal with a different element, and that was Hollywood. Hollywood is a very aggressive medium, difficult to get any story or any idea out into the public, but he persevered like no other, and he created his own universe just as Stan Lee did. His Star Trek debuted in 1966, and it captured the imagination of tens of thousands, if not more, instantly, and it was a huge success. Now, the 1960s was a very pivotal decade. In fact, it was more than that. It was more of a groundbreaking decade. You had movies that were coming into prominence that were science fiction related. You had H.G. Wells' Time Machine in 1960, a personal favorite of mine in 1964 called Robinson Crusoe on Mars. And in 1968, Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston and the very talented Roddy McDowall. But all of those were completely overshadowed by Star Trek. Star Trek was an absolute phenomenon, and children who are big comic collectors now had something else to root for: Kirk and Spock. We'd grown up with these characters. We loved these characters. What Gene Roddenberry did was he set a futuristic scene for humankind. In other words, and he dovetailed that with Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's vision of the future, where it was a very diverse crew. You had everyone from a black communications officer in the form of Lieutenant Uhura. You had a Vulcan science officer who was half human, and you even had a Russian helmsman because the Soviet Union at the time was complaining there was no Russian representation. Remember, the Cold War was still very much alive and well in the 60s. This was absolutely groundbreaking, to say the least, and it again captured the imagination so much that when the final episode aired in 1969, a campaign of letters was sent to NBC Studios, who was running Star Trek at the time. Now, this is, of course, before email. There were tens of thousands of letters sent to NBC demanding that it return to the airwaves. NBC, however, like many of the suits in Hollywood, didn't look at the growing element that was science fiction. They looked at their numbers. They looked at the ratings, and ratings were high for the first two seasons, and they dropped as the space race sort of went sort of. It had its up and down moments, and when it went down in 1969, Star Trek was moved to Friday, which is sort of the graveyard of shows at the time. If you wanted to show a television show in the evening. But the success continued because the people who loved Star Trek wanted to keep this on. They didn't give up any pressure whatsoever. They continued to hound NBC, and it wasn't Paramount, but whoever was running Star Trek at the time. They didn't get any success until the animated series in 1973. The animated series was, if you remember Saturday morning cartoons when I was a kid, it was, Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner, that sort of thing. And then this shows up here, also on NBC as well. It had the original cast with the original voices of the cast from the original series, and it only lasted one season, but this was absolutely incredible. I think this is still to this day, one of the most underrated series regarding Star Trek because, again, it had the original cast voices. It even had a guest appearance on one episode with Spock's father, played by it was Sarek, a Vulcan, played by Mark Leonard, and it was absolutely exceptional, to say the least. I wish there was more episodes, but that's all there was. And after that ended, most people thought, well, that was the end of Star Trek. Well, in 1977, another person who most people hadn't heard of put together a cast that no one had heard of, and his name was George Lucas, and he created something called Star Wars. Star Wars, of course, was an absolute phenomenon, and excited the science fiction world. But by the way, I bring this up here. This is not Star Wars, but this is a movie from 1956 called Forbidden Planet. Gene Roddenberry had admitted that he had been inspired by this particular movie. This movie, again, made in 1956, still holds up to this day. It starred a very young Leslie Nielsen, and it looks like very much an early Federation Star Trek crew. It also had a robot called Robbie the Robot. And I bring this up because I don't think Gene Roddenberry was the only one who was inspired by this movie. I think another man named Irwin Allen was also drew attention to this movie because, again, he had some fame and success with the CBS series Lost in Space. But anyway, there's nothing wrong with artists and scientists and whoever else draws off other people's work. That's how you grow as a community, and it's no different in the art world or the entertainment world. But that was the beginnings of the science fiction and space exploration, which again was in its infancy. But after the success of Star Wars, whoever was running Paramount looked at their franchises and said, well, what do we have here? Oh, wait, there's this thing called Star Trek. Maybe we could revive that. And they did in 1979. The movies, the Star Trek movies, returned to the big screen. The first movie, the Star Trek motion picture, was okay, but all they cared about was the box office sales. It was very, very successful, which generated the second, probably the best movie, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. The uniforms were more colorful, great special effects. You had introduction of Kirstie Alley, who played Saavik, who was also famous on the TV show Cheers. It expanded more because of the special effects were far better than they were in the original series, which they were basically shoestring budgets. By the way, the original series doesn't get the credit that it deserves, coming up with decent special effects on next to no budget. But Star Trek II was absolutely exceptional. This had movies for the next 2 years, all the way to the sixth movie, which was Star Trek: The Undiscovered Country. Now, Star Trek 2 and 6 were directed by Nicholas Meyer, an outstanding director. What he did was he looked at the original series, and this one, Space Seed, caught his attention. So he brought back Ricardo Montalban, who reprised his role as Khan. This was an award-winning performance in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. But Hollywood, even back then, well, actually even today, doesn't really give the credit it's due to science fiction on any level. Look at the incredible Marvel movies who are getting very little to no recognition. There is the very young Ricardo Montalban from the original series Space Seed, episode Space Seed. He was the perfect person to bring forward into the movies. This was a lot of fun for me because, again, I had something to look forward to for every 2 years or so. And it seemed like Star Trek was alive and well and back into the limelight. Well, Gene Roddenberry, who had created Star Trek in the first place, wasn't done with this franchise. He started again on taking his idea off the big screen and back on back to the television screen with Star Trek: The Next Generation. By the way, the one thing that isn't noted is that is one of the most gorgeous ships in all of science fiction. That is the USS Excelsior. I love the design and I love the lines of these particular ships. They hold up to this day. But my favorite to this day is the refit of the USS Enterprise. That is by far the most gorgeous vessel in all of science fiction. Nothing else even comes close to that. But let's go to the Next Generation because, again, Gene Roddenberry, who had created the original series and picked everyone by hand, did exactly the same thing with this Next Generation. Chose the cast, chose the crew, chose the people, the writers, the special effects people, everyone that he chose back in the original series, because, again, he knew what to look for, and very much like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby formed their own Marvel bullpen, and that would be something that would prove beneficial later in life. So Gene Roddenberry, again, knew exactly what to do. He was as talented and gifted as a story writer as Stan Lee was. And to have one, not just one, but two incredibly successful franchises is no accident. The man was unbelievably intelligent, unbelievably gifted. Star Trek: The Next Generation was far more popular towards the end of its series than the original series ever could be. It introduced new elements too. Patrick Stewart played opposite John Delancey in a character called the Q. I love the Q. Those two played off each other extremely well. It was a fun story, but it expanded the look into the Klingon Empire, and it introduced another element called the Borg. All were very, very wildly successful. And again, John Delancey was the perfect opposite of Stewart. I loved every single appearance that he showed up in. And people were very, very angry when this series came to an end. They didn't want it to end. And so, again, Star Trek still resonated very much with the population. That was one of my favorite episodes when Q loses his power. He had a lot of fun on the show, and I miss it to this day. And Patrick Stewart, we all know, who later played Professor X in the X-Men movies. Again, he was a multi-versatile actor, extremely intelligent, and extremely gifted. The problem, sadly, was that in 1991, during I think it was episode 3 or 4 of The Next Generation, Gene Roddenberry died suddenly of a massive heart attack. He was 70 years old. And many of us, myself included, thought, well, that was that. That's probably the end of Star Trek as we know it. But what I did anticipate was, again, the bullpen that he had put together, a bullpen which consisted largely of 3 people, Rick Berman, Michael Piller, and Jerry Taylor. They continued on the Star Trek franchise because, like the Marvel bullpen, who knew what Stanley and Kirby wanted, these 3 people knew what Gene Roddenberry wanted. And they continued on with the first series without Gene Roddenberry, and that was called Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine starred Avery Brooks as Captain Benjamin Sisko. The series started a bit slow, but people gravitated towards it early because, again, the powerful cast, especially with Avery Brooks and who else was there? Terry Farrell and others. They started to gel and come into their own. Later they brought Michael Dorn as Worf. These were exceptional series, and I love them to this day. It was they explored the Cardassian Empire, and they were the first crew that wasn't affiliated, or pardon me, not connected with the Federation. They were in Cardassian space. Something else that Star Trek fans had to look forward to: a new world, a new culture, and so forth. Later on, they produced probably their better series, which was Star Trek Voyager. Voyager was, again, a very diverse crew with a female captain called Captain Janeway, played brilliantly by Kate Mulgrew, a very experienced actress. We learned in this particular series more about the Borg as they incorporated a woman named Seven of Nine, played by Jerry Ryan, extremely beautiful, attractive, and talented actress. Tim Russ was exceptional as Tuvok. Growing up when you were a kid, everyone wanted to be either Kirk or Spock. If I grew up in the 90s, I'd rather be Tuvok or the Doctor, played here by Robert Picardo, who was a holographic character, another type of characters and life forms, if you will. They explored the element of artificial life. So again, this is what I loved about the series. They were exceptionally brilliant. They were awe-inspiring, and they made you think. One of the best episodes of Star Trek Voyager was an episode where we find another Q called Quinn, and he represents the continuum where Q comes from. And what they reveal in this particular episode is that this species started out as humans did, as mortals. They went to immortality, and then they went to omnipotence. And they discovered literally everything about the universe. And during this discovery, it was centuries of discussion, and it was a wonderful time for them. And then the most tragic thing possibly happened to them. They ran out of things to talk about because they literally discovered everything. So think about that. You get to a point in your life, millions of years down the road, and you have discovered everything. There's nothing to talk about, and it becomes a living hell because you're immortal and can't end your life. This particular character wants to commit suicide, and that was a very awe-inspiring story among dozens of others. It was probably the best of the four. Well, not one of the best of the 4, no question about it. And people were also very, very sad when this came to an end. The last 2 series, I didn't bring any pictures of because they didn't inspire me that much, and that was Enterprise. And Enterprise lasted for 2 or 3 seasons. It was the first Star Trek, I believe, to be canceled. And then it went to the movies years later, I think in 2008 with J.J. Abrams. And therein lies my problem with, as a Star Trek aficionado, J.J. Abrams is probably the worst person to be directing. I think, in my personal view, he's one of the most overrated directors in all of Hollywood. J.J. Abrams is a Star Wars person. There's nothing wrong with Star Wars, but those who understand the two franchises know the two do not mix. And the first movie with Star Trek, with Christopher Pine playing Captain Kirk, and Anthony Quinto, I think was his name, or Zachary Quinto, pardon me, who played Spock. They looked like Kirk and Spock, but they didn't act like Kirk and Spock. The cast was awful. They were immature. The storyline was awful. The special effects looked like, again, Star Wars effects, not Star Trek. And a Star Trek aficionado like myself could tell the difference. The second movie was barely tolerable, but it starred, who was it who played Doctor Strange? I'm drawing a blank on his name all of a sudden. But he made back. Thank you, Benedict Cumberbatch. We didn't know he was going to be Doctor Strange at the time, but his performance was exceptional. Other than that, the movie was awful. The third movie came out. I never bothered to see it. Abrams is now talking about a movie in 2023. If he's behind the wheel, my recommendation is don't bother, because again, just like Marvel, and we'll talk about this in the next episode, that the MCU seems to be getting away from the Marvel Stan Lee format, and I think that is a mistake. But I bring up Star Trek because, just like we brought up in the last episode, DC Detective Comics has such a deep, rich history, just like Star Trek does. I think it may be simply a matter of time before someone picks up this mantle and revives it, because there's too much history, too much storyline, and it is too precious to people like myself and people who grew up with this thing to let it go to the wayside. So hopefully someone will revive this and bring it back the way it's supposed to be. So let's go to our picks of the week. And sort of along the same lines here, there are a few Star Trek comics I wanted to bring forward here. This I've never seen. I've never had. This is on the list. To the left is Star Trek 1. That is the first appearance. That is the Golden Key record. Pardon me, not Golden Key record. Golden Key comics. And if you can find this for any price whatsoever, I'd get your hands on it. Again, I've never had one. I'd love to have one, but to the right is the second issue, and I think probably the most valuable and underrated and affordable of the two. And I think if you're going to invest money, I'd start there. But there's a few of them, and not all of them have these pictures of the original cast on the cover. I look for the ones that do, and you're not going to make any money right away. These are just a sentimental purchase, and these are all long-term purchases. But if you do buy those are the ones I would highly recommend. And again, get the ones with the original cast on the cover. Switching now to Marvel, we just had the Thor: Love and Thunder movie. So Hercules, no spoiler alert, I think everyone knows that Hercules is in the movie. If you didn't get Journey into Mystery Annual 1, I think you missed the boat. I would wait quite a while before you do get that, but I would recommend you getting the first appearance of Zeus and the first appearance of Hercules. But these are two that are still largely underappreciated and undervalued, I think. To the left is Tales to Astonished number 79. It is a gorgeous cover. I believe that's Marie Severin. I could be wrong, and forgive me for not doing my homework on this one. But get it just for the battle. That is one of the best battles ever between Hercules and Thor. It's their first meeting. This is a classic story, a classic battle. To the right is Hercules, the miniseries. I got this back in the 80s. It was a 4-issue miniseries. Hercules, there is so much depth to this particular character. I don't think that Marvel has really tapped into it as much. There's still so much that they can do with it. And to the center here is another underappreciated and extremely undervalued book. That is Thor 227, Thor versus Hercules, another great battle with an appearance of Zeus. These are the ones I would certainly recommend to get your hands on. This you might wait on this because let the Thor: Love and Thunder movie die off, but I would get these probably sooner than later, and especially as the dip continues, as the economy continues to go into recession and inflation. For the next episode, guys, we're going to get into a detailed look at Thor: Love and Thunder. I'm not going to do this tonight. I think it's still too soon. Give everyone another couple of weeks so that everyone sees the movie. I want to get into detail for this reason. One, not just the Easter eggs, but by the time we have our next broadcast 2 weeks ago, the MCU will have made its announcement regarding Phase 5. What troubles me, and we'll get into this in the next segment, is that as an older collector, it is becoming harder and harder to predict what the MCU is doing, what direction they're going into, and why they're going in direction they're going into. So we'll see if we can find any clues by what is revealed at this year's Comic-Con and their latest incarnation, Thor: Love and Thunder. Everyone, thanks for joining. For the Ian Hoodrat Network, I'm Dan De La Torre, and this is Comic Book Corner.